Fletcher Tabuto.
The opportunity to speak on this energy innovation legislation. Sir, can I just say, and I know it's being a bit trite, but I can just imagine Mr Bridges in consultation with his ministry staff as they came into the office and told him, "Sir, we're going to call it energy innovation." You can just imagine his excitement. You know, "Oh, that's excellent, that's fantastic," he would say. It sends a message to New Zealanders about how innovative the government really is. It does, doesn't it? It sends a message, right? We're more innovative than all of the rest combined. Is there any way, he would say, is there any way we can take an innovative photo to go with that? But here we are. It's not that innovative, and I think, unfortunately, the Minister has let the people of New Zealand down with this legislation, although, to be fair, unlike much of the legislation that New Zealand has opposed in the past, where the intent sounds wonderful, it sounds good, actually the opposite effect would take hold. At least with this legislation, sir, I can, with some pleasure, stand up on behalf of New Zealand First and say, actually, the intent is there, and when we read the legislation and get feedback from industry, it might make a tiny little bit of difference, and it won't actually do the damage that other pieces of legislation that this National Party has put through the House. So here I am, with great pleasure, Mr Naylor, saying that New Zealand First will support this piece of legislation through its first reading. So, that's another debate, but anyway, that's another debate. So to be fair, this is taking some tiny baby steps in the right direction. We think we'll support it all the way through. It's important to note that there was previously an engagement with industry, and there wasn't much negative, but I will highlight what the feedback was, because I think the Minister needs to take that on board, sir, in terms of how they move forward with the support of business and industry, not just the energy sector. So I will bring that up in a moment, sir. So I think we have a bill designed to encourage the take-up of electric vehicles if we listen to the Minister and those on the other side of the House. Can I say to the Minister that this bill will be as significant and as helpful as the 2% threshold placed on the heavy vehicle fleet? For example, when I first started reading the legislation, sir, I was actually quite excited about the prospect of the road user charges exemption being moved up to the heavy vehicle fleet. I thought, here's an opportunity to, as inefficient as it is, as noted by a previous speaker, it was something meaningful and tangible that industry could get their teeth into and move forward. But then you read further on, and credit to the Minister, he said it himself, actually we'll only give it to 2% of the fleet. And when you do the numbers, given last year's figures, there's several 100,000 in that heavy vehicle fleet already. And so this then would apply to less than 3,000 heavy vehicle units on the road. So from everyday New Zealanders' perspective, I don't think that in their minds would be a tangible take-up or make any kind of significant difference. And I would like to add to that, it is not the most efficient use of funding. I think what you want to do is put some money down to actually encourage the uptake of commercial vehicles by private users. So it was disappointing, to say the least. What I wanted to touch on was the broader issues, because the Minister, and I'll find a quote here it is, the Minister said, "The transport and industrial sectors are areas where the most impact can be made on improving New Zealand's energy productivity and reducing emissions." What I'd like to point out to the Minister is that he's kind of completely overlooked the area of transport where most gains could be made. And I speak specifically about light rail, the electrification of the New Zealand rail. And this is a Minister that has overseen the rail network being de-electrified. He said how important it is. He's quoted publicly as saying how important it is in our commitments to Paris, and yet this is a Minister who has overseen the de-electrification of the rail network. Not only that, he's seen the closing down of sections of rail, and then what do you know, a year or two later, the government's decided, despite their predisposed opposition to rail for some unknown reason, sir, that they would have to open up that link again because it was the most efficient way of moving goods on our national infrastructure. So it's quite narrow in focus, but as I've said, I acknowledge today National is taking baby steps in the right direction, although the business sector has already moved out in front of them quite significantly. So they're already behind the 8 ball there and need to step up to the mark. And it's probably the opportune time to point out perhaps the Minister himself could at least make his limo an electric vehicle. That might send some signals, and it might be the start of a practical solution to the problem that they have acknowledged. I say they, the National Party have acknowledged that this country has. So we need the legislation, but as I intimated earlier, what we had in engagement with industry slightly before this legislation came to the House was feedback from a significant amount of those who were spoken to, who came back and said, what you're doing right now is expanding the EECA's mandate. You're giving them more money and you're taking it from different pools, but you haven't told us how they're going to be used, how they're going to use those funds. So, for example, sir, this legislation broadens the EECA's mandate quite significantly, and so doing there will now be a combined energy levy. It's going to consult and report annually, and I think when you consider the background of the National Party over there, I think consulting and reporting annually is a huge step forward in terms of transparency and accountability for the National Party. So we're halfway there. But what the industry wanted, sir, was a logical link to show how that money was being taken from them and how it was being used for them. And that's fair enough. They're not saying we need a plan, we need a definitive plan. I think several members in the House have acknowledged the industry is innovative, and they want to move forward themselves. But they want some reassurance. They want what they coined as rationality, and I think they have every reason to be concerned, and the Minister needs to take that into account. And the legislation, bearing in mind this was a consultation document, has not done so in this first draft of the bill. So that's something for the Minister to consider. So he has much to consider. There is basically no time to delay. New Zealand does need to act, and we need to act quickly, which is why these many steps are important. They won't do the opposite of what the intent says it will, so we'll be supporting it in the first reading. But the Minister described this bill as enabling great initiatives that empower and encourage take-up of e-vehicles, such as non-financial options like allowing e-vehicles to use the bus lane. Well, this bill doesn't actually do that. We're going to need another Minister to enable that, and they're actually not mandating that centrally. They're giving councils the right to make that decision, and I mean there's a whole other debate point for the House to consider about whether the central government is brave enough to say let's do it or let's not. Let's not fob it off to councils. So I'd like to point out to the Ministers of Tertiary Education and Education that in doing some analysis for this bill, we realised in engaging with industry that there are no or so significantly few EV mechanics right now in New Zealand that an uptake of any magnitude would not be taken up well by the industry itself. And I put it as a question to the Minister and those ministers: does the industry need help in terms of training and skill, upskilling young New Zealand workers to cope with this? So to conclude, this bill is a start. It could even be described as a good start, which is why New Zealand First will support it today. It does not make it any easier to buy an electric vehicle. It does not make access to charging stations any easier across the country. But for the National Party, it is something slightly more than nothing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Good speech.